Thank you, Pastor Strickland. It's great to be with you all, even though it is by Zoom. And as Pastor Strickland indicated, this is really the second part of kind of a two-part series on Baptist history. The first part looked at English Baptist roots. One could easily do, I'm sure you all know, well, look at American Baptist history, because in the United States, Baptists are probably the largest Protestant denomination, definitely in the southern states. And almost like in some parts of the United States, almost like the established church. And so obviously Baptist history is a very, very important part of the American scene. But we're going to look primarily at Canada. And in fact, we're going to primarily look at Ontario. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, is there enough material in Ontario? Baptist Witness begins here in the 1790s. Is there enough material here to occupy us for 3 months? Well, let me assure you that there is indeed. We will have recourse to talking about American Baptists because they will have an initial influence. We'll pick up some English Baptist background again, and also Scottish Baptists, who are very, very important for the formation of Baptist churches in the Ottawa Valley. But tonight, what I want to do is I really want to, after I'm going to go over the kind of schedule for us, but tonight what I really want to do is I just want to talk about the 18th century here in Ontario. And I'm going to cover elements of really the political struggles that occupied the people who lived here in not simply Ontario, but also the eastern seaboard of what we could now call North America, and the struggles between the British and the French, but especially the way in which they involved the First Nations. And I think one of the, at least the drawbacks in my own education in the Canadian system was virtually nothing taught about the First Peoples. And I'm sure that that is now very, very different. I'm thinking of, I went through the high school system in the late 60s, early 70s, and I'm quite certain that concerns over the last 50 years have rectified that. I certainly hope they do. I have a little book that would have been typical of what we were given when we came to Canada. I'm an immigrant. So we came to Canada in the mid 60s, and it's a little book on the history of Canada. I didn't possess it from the 60s. I picked it up recently. And I was shocked, very shocked, that as it began the history of Canada, it began with the French exploration of what we now call Quebec, with people like Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain, etc. Nothing virtually about the First Nations. And the narrative that I would have been taught in the 60s and 70s was one that really excluded those people groups, but they have played a very, very important role. In fact, the British victory in the long struggle with the French for the control of North America would have been impossible without the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, which we'll talk a little bit about. Okay, so what I want to do then is really give historical background to the formation of Ontario and Baptist life here. And let me give you also a kind of an overview of where we're going to go in this 3 months. And I'm going to share the screen with a PowerPoint presentation that I have. So you all should be able to see that. That is the first picture there of this is a baptism. 1837 is when this was drawn. It's a German Baptist baptism of obviously a number of believers. And this would have been typical of Baptist life in the 19th century. Most Baptists were baptized not in indoor baptistries, but in the open air, in streams and rivers and in lakes. One of the fun little texts we'll read is about in the 1840s, a group of Baptists at Bond Street Baptist Church in Toronto, deciding that they would have a baptism in February, open air. So what are you going to do in February? Well, they troop out to Lake Ontario, cut a hole in the ice, and R.A. Fife, who was the Baptist minister, has to stand in the ice in the hole for at least a number of minutes while he baptizes a variety of people. Kind of a Baptist polar bear dip, if you might want. Anyway, so we'll get to that sort of stuff. Our forebears were incredibly hardy individuals, as we will see. So let me talk here a little bit then about the where we're going to go in the course or of lectures. Tonight, historical context in what I call the long 18th century, which is historians, when they talk about the past, they divide things up arbitrarily. So, for instance, the 1960s, when did that begin? Well, that did not begin in 1960 or 1961, as historians estimated. It began in 1963 when the Beatles landed at JFK Airport, and John F. Kennedy was assassinated at the end of that year. Division of history is according to cultural changes. Another example before we turn to the long 18th century, the 20th century, when did it begin? Well, 1914, the beginning of the First World War, that shatters that whole world that we call the Victorian and Edwardian world. When did it end? 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and ended the domination of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. The long 18th century is a period that begins around the 1680s and runs through to the 18 teens, which is exactly the period we're going to look at today. It's a cultural piece. It traces the rise of Britain, and that's what we're looking at: the rise of Britain as the dominant world empire. In the 1680s, Britain was a minor power in Northern Europe, really not a major player on the European continent. By the 18 teens, she had defeated the French at the Battle of Waterloo to give her domination of the European continent and really a world power. And all of that, you might be thinking, well, I thought we were talking about Baptists and the church. Well, as I'm sure you've seen in the last couple of years, our life as a church is deeply bound up with the larger social, political context. And to ignore the latter means we don't understand the former to some degree. And again, a very small example, one we looked at last year, William Carey was able to go to India on a British ship because the British had taken India, at least the eastern part of India, in the 1760s. And it was an open mission field as far as he was concerned. And this obviously in the late 20th century has caused some people to say that the advance of the church has been bound up with British imperialism in the 19th century, American imperialism in the 20th century, but the situation is much more complex, as we'll see a little bit of that today. So today we're going to look at the historical context. And then the next 2 weeks, we're going to look at Baptists in Ontario. Ontario used to be called Upper Canada. Upper Canada because when you came to Ontario, say from Europe, you had to come by boat. And you came up the St. Lawrence, and you passed initially Lower Canada, Quebec, and then you came into Upper Canada. By the 1830s, 1840s, a lock system had been developed that joined the St. Lawrence to Lake Ontario and navigable also to Lake Erie. So, and then after an event called the Upper Canada Rebellion, Canada's never really had a revolution. Its history isn't as exciting as some other countries. That's probably a good thing, to be honest. Who wants to actually live through a violent revolution? But we did have a little rebellion in Upper Canada. It took place on a weekend. And William Lyon Mackenzie and a bunch of
disgruntled Canadians marched down, tried to take control of the legislature in the city of York. The militia turned out, few shots were fired, and that was the end of the rebellion. And but after that, Canada was governed as one province from Britain, and it was known as Canada East, Quebec, and Canada West. And that was the situation until Confederation in 1867. So we're going to look at Baptists in Canada West in a couple of weeks. And then we have some interesting figures we want to look at. R.A. Fife, sometimes known as Mr. Baptist in the 19th century. And then William McMaster, you should know that name. He's the money behind McMaster University, which was initially founded in Toronto. And we want to look at a pastor named B.D. Thomas, who was a Welshman who came to what we now call Jarvis Street Baptist Church. And we're going to talk about Baptists in Toronto. And then we spend 2 weeks on the McMaster controversy. This is the great battle in the 1920s over the nature of Scripture against liberalism. Probably the dominant figure in that is T.T. Shields. It has enormous impact here in Hamilton. Probably the key figure in Hamilton is Clifford J. Loney, who was the pastor of Stanley Avenue Baptist Church, where I was converted and married and baptized as a believer. And there was all kinds of debacle here in Ontario, in Hamilton, over the issue of liberalism. Houston Street Baptist Church actually ended up in the courts. There was an attempt by some in the church to keep the church in the old convention. Others wanted to take it out. They wanted to keep the property, and it had to go to the courts. And then McMaster moved here in 1930, and that caused the whole thing to get thrown up again. We'll talk a little bit about T.T. Shields. T.T. Shields still casts a huge shadow. He died in 1955, but he casts a huge shadow over Baptist life in Ontario. And we'll see some of that. And pretty well all of the men who formed what we call the fellowship, of which our church is a member, were taught by T.T. Shields. And so that's why it's important to understand him to some degree. And we'll talk about the formation of the fellowship. I want to look at Baptists in Quebec, this remarkable growth of the church in Quebec. In the 70s and 80s, they probably experienced a degree of revival, going from probably about 19 churches in 1970 to about 80 or 90 churches in 1990. Just remarkable growth in that period. And then I'm going to talk about some Fellowship Baptist leaders, some really, as I look back now, some are really remarkable men like Hal McBain, W. Gordon Brown, Bob Holmes, Les Tarr, and we'll talk about those. And then the final week, we have a panel discussion, which I gather Jamie will moderate between myself and Paul Carter. Paul is the pastor of First Baptist Church in Orillia, which was a kind of a main church in that area in the convention. And I think they've just left the convention. And we'll talk about what it was like to be in the convention after the split in the 20s and so on. So that's some idea as to where we're going to go. Hopefully at the end of these 3 months, you'll have a good feel for Baptist life in Ontario. Baptists have never been the most populous body in Ontario. Among evangelicals, we're probably the fourth or fifth in terms of size. But I suspect most of us who are on this are Baptists. We're Canadian Baptists and we're Ontario Baptists, and it's helpful to know what did those who came before us, what did they intend by the planting of our churches? What did they see as essential to our life as Christians together? And it's helpful, I think, very helpful to have these roots reflected on and remembered. But tonight, as I said, we're going to look at background, and I'm trying to juggle a few things here at the same time. So I've got my lecture notes on a laptop, and my main computer has got the share screen feature. So And sometimes my laptop kicks out, so you'll need to bear with me occasionally. Okay, so about 3 years ago, I do this every 3 years. I taught a course on Canadian evangelicalism at Heritage in Cambridge. And it's a cycle course. It comes back every 3 or 4 years. And so by Canadian evangelicalism, I look at much more than Baptist, obviously. I look at Anglican evangelicalism. I look at Methodism, Presbyterianism, the Brethren, the Plymouth Brethren, Pentecostalism in Ontario, Canada, and of course, Baptists. And the end of the course is really a fun day. We spend a whole Saturday. We basically go around, usually either Southern Ontario from Hamilton down to Lake Ontario or in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. And we go to about 5 or 6 churches, all different. And so this time, about 3 years ago, we went to a Baptist church, a Pentecostal church, a couple of a Brethren church, and a Mennonite church. I think there were 4, maybe there might have been 5. The first church on the list was the Mennonite church. And when we got there, we were met by 2 of the leaders. So this is before the pandemic, so we didn't have to worry about social distancing and masks and all that. And the person leading began the meeting very interesting in a way I had never heard. And it was a woman. She said this: "We begin this meeting by acknowledging that we are meeting on Aboriginal land that has been inhabited by the Haudenosaunee of the 6 nations of the Grand River." And she said that and then moved on. Well, to be honest, I'm a historian. So I just started thinking, I don't remember anything else. She told us pretty well about their congregation there, because I'm now thinking, okay, so the Haudenosaunee, this is the Iroquois Confederacy, was given this land by the British under the leadership of Joseph Brant after the American Revolution. But before that, it was owned by if it was owned, because the First Peoples have a different relationship to land than we do, by the Huron. And the Haudenosaunee and the Huron didn't like each other. That's probably putting it mildly. And I suddenly realized the complexity of history, the way it's bound up with not only the territorial fights between the British and the French, and the British and the French coming in and occupying this land, but also very much bound up with the fights between the First Peoples or the First Nations. And I think one of the mistakes that we sometimes have is we have this idea that before European immigration to the New World, that this was some sort of paradise. And it wasn't, because the various people groups here found themselves at odds with each other. And so let me begin with that, and then move into the background of the long 18th century. Let me go to this slide. And this shows you in 2 maps the original occupants of what is now Ontario. They are mostly the Huron and Algonquian peoples. And they found themselves, they're the ones who make first contact with the French. And they found themselves becoming involved in French trading activities, particularly beaver pelts. The beaver was Southern Ontario and New England were basically, to put it bluntly, overrun by beavers. I mean, the place was just a beaver paradise for beavers. And the Europeans, when they came here, discovered that first of all, they discovered the plentifulness of beavers, and they discovered that beavers could provide them not only with fur for hats and coats, but also with material for leggings, women's leggings, men's leggings. And when the beaver trade dried up with Russia in the 1600s, North America became the main place to get beavers. And the Algonquin and Huron became a major trading partners with the French in the early 17th centuries. Now, south of Lake Ontario, you have a very different group of First Nations. These are and they speak different languages, very different language, completely different linguistic basis. These are the 5 nations. Actually, we know them as the 6 nations, and you can see them listed there: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. There is another little group in the Onondaga area called the Tuscarora, and that's where you get the 6 nations. During the 1600s, they were beginning to expand their influence. They had agreed in the 1500s to work together, to share common defense, common war, but they would have their own internal governments. But in the 1600s, they began to expand their influence north of Lake Ontario, where they came into conflict with the Huron and the Algonquian. And their initial contact was warlike. And there were wars all through the 17th century. They're known as the Beaver Wars, because they basically were the attempt of the 5 nations or 6 nations, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, to basically take control of the beaver trade. And they essentially do in many ways. And so that's in the background. That's an internal war or conflict between the First Nations. And then thrown into that, you have then this context where you have British, Spanish, and French coming into the New World. I'm not going to go into all the details, the founding of British colonies, the founding of French colonies. But by around the 1700s, you can see the map there. The British basically own a line of colonies. Here you can see my cursor running from just about Nova Scotia all the way down to Georgia. Florida is owned by the Spanish. And I'll say a little bit about Florida in a minute. And then the French own everything beyond the Appalachians. This ridge here is basically the Appalachian Mountains. And they basically had the British bottled up on the eastern seaboard with the Appalachians. Now, this was not a peaceful settlement, because during this period, you have war. And the wars reflect wars in Europe. The French and the English fight each other pretty well every decade between 1680s and the 18 teens, 130 years of pretty well perpetual war. There's only one decade, the 1720s, when they don't fight each other in Europe. And these wars were replicated in America. And we have the various names there. King William's War, that's William III, Queen Anne's War, King George, that's George II. That war is particularly important because that's the war that leads to the British conquest of Nova Scotia and the removal of the French from Acadia. They take all the French inhabitants and move them down to really what is now Louisiana. And that's still remembered. That's why Louisiana is got a Francophone base. Probably the most important war for our consideration is the French and Indian War, which breaks out in 1754. It's part of a larger conflict in the world. It's going on in the Atlantic Ocean with battles between the French and British navies. It's war in Europe, the continent. It's war in India, in Africa, North Africa as well. And but here in North America, it's known as the French and Indian War. And in Quebec, it's known as the War of the Conquest, because it leads to the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1759, where the British defeat the French and now basically have removed French control of any sort of French control in America, North America, and they're now the dominant power. And after the French and Indian War, the the British pass a thing called the Quebec Act. And the Quebec Act, the British are now confronted. They've got a large body of French-speaking people. They're Roman Catholic. They speak French. They have French civil law. So how are they going to deal with that scenario? There was too large a population to do what they did in Acadia. In Acadia, in Nova Scotia, they had basically deported all the Francophones and removed them to Louisiana. But they couldn't do that in Quebec. And in 1774, they passed the Quebec Act, which allows the French to have their own language, to have the Roman Catholic Church to be basically the established church, and to have French civil law, which is very different from British common law in some areas. The Americans, the colonials who had fought with the British against the French, felt that this was a complete betrayal. It would take us too far afield to go into how to be British in the 18th century was to be Protestant and not French. To be French and Catholic was to be under the control of the Antichrist, because the Pope was the Antichrist. You've got this complex interlocking of religion and politics. And many of the Americans felt the Quebec Act of 1774 betrayed them. And it was a major factor leading to what we now know as the American Revolution, which broke out in 1775. And there's another map which indicates the status of North America now in 1775. You'll notice the states, there's 13 states that rebel against England. Obviously, by the way, the very language I'm using indicates a kind of pro-British orientation, right? I'm talking about the American Revolution, not the American War of Independence. I'm talking about the Americans as rebels and the Loyalists, those who want to remain true to the crown. The states that rebel are Massachusetts all the way down to Georgia. By this point in time, England owns Florida. And England would lose Florida. Man, we should have kept it. It would have been great, right? We would, as Canadians, we would have we'd have a vacation paradise. But we lost Florida. For some odd, very odd reason, Nova Scotia decides not to join the rebellion. And of course, Quebec doesn't either, right here. And with the end of the war stretches from 1775 to 1783. And at the end of that war, Britain loses it. It was almost impossible for Britain to win the war in some ways, because they're basically, the Americans originate what we now call guerrilla warfare. They've learned this from their Iroquois Confederacy allies. They refuse to go into the way the British would want to fight a battle, out in the open air, or an open field rather. The Americans are conducting guerrilla tactics. And Britain is 3,000 miles across, the Atlantic, and trying to supply troops. And then the British were very upset with the Americans, because the Americans insisting on fighting in the winter. When all civilized people, you don't fight in the winter, right? You go home and have Christmas, and then you start again in the new year. The Americans were naughty. They insisted on fighting in the winter. And so the long and the short of it is America wins that revolution. And so we have this situation then. We have British North America, which consists of Newfoundland over here. They will be the last to join Confederation, 1940s. It's hard to believe that. Nova Scotia, St. John Island, which is PEI, New Brunswick, and then the two Canadian provinces that we know as Quebec and Ontario. And what I'm interested in here, obviously, is the presence of Loyalists in Ontario. You'll notice where they initially settle. Over here near Kingston, you can see my cursor, I hope. Near Kingston, the North Shore of Lake Ontario, the Niagara Peninsula, where we are, the North Shore of Lake Erie, and then the Detroit area. The settlement up here along Lake Huron, and then up here in Lake Superior comes much later. And so the initial, it's not surprising that the Loyalists, so who are the Loyalists? Initially, there's about 5,000 of them. At the end of the American Revolution, about 5,000 American families want to be true to the crown, and they're offered 200 acres of free land in Ontario if they will cross over and farm it. Now you might think, well, that's brilliant. Well, you have to remember, Southern Ontario is virtually a canopy of trees. There's a saying that in this period, a squirrel could go from Owen Sound to Niagara Falls and never have to touch the ground. And that's probably an exaggeration. But when you drive through Ontario, Southern Ontario today, which I've done many times, you're not seeing the topography of the land that the earliest settlers saw. The open fields, all those fields have been cleared of the trees. And most of these families wouldn't have had horses. So how do you clear the trees? You have to chop them down, but then how do you get rid of the stumps? You have to burn them out. It would be very, very difficult. And then you've got inclement weather, obviously, from November-ish to March. It's very, very difficult in the early days. By around 1791, there's about 10,000 Loyalists have crossed over, along with a large number of the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee, who fought with the British under the command of Joseph Brant against the Americans. And they're given a huge tract of land running up along the Grand River on both sides, which would obviously go up into Kitchener-Waterloo. Hence that statement by the Mennonite woman at the beginning of my lecture tonight. Now, most of these people who came over, they were individual families shattered by war. It was a civil war. The American Revolution is a civil war. It's English-speaking settlers fighting each other. Brother against brother, father against son, neighbor against neighbor. And many of these people who come are shattered by the war. Many of them, their husbands or fathers have spent 6-7 years in war. The bonds of community, this is where I'm leading, the bonds of community have been shattered. And also, war normally is not good for religious growth. In fact, in America, after the American Revolution, it is a very low time for evangelicals. And many of the men and women who came to Canada, to be honest, were godless. And many of them came for free land. I mean, we have this glorious picture of the United Empire Loyalists. Obviously, many of them wanted to be true to the crown, but many of them, 200 acres of free land, that's a bargain. If I have to live under the rule of the king, well, who cares? So here, let me give you 3 quotes by early Christian workers in Ontario. And this is the spiritual state of Upper Canada prior to the War of 1812. The man there, that is Nathan Bangs. He is a Methodist preacher who worked for 12 years in Ontario and in Quebec. But before I get to his quote, here is Asahel Morse. He was an itinerant Baptist minister. This is the way he described Upper Canada. It is a dismal region of moral darkness and the shadow of death, where most families had no books, not even a Bible, and were grossly ignorant. Methodist revivalist, this is Nathan Bangs, that's the man who's there. That's a photograph of him in the 1850s. He described York, that's Toronto, a town of people as wicked as the Canaanites of old. And John Strawn, that's how you'd say his name, Scottish Anglican. He was the first Anglican bishop in Toronto, observed in 1803. Every parish in this country is to be made. The people have very little or no religion. Their minds are so prone to low cunning, it'll be difficult to make anything of them. He had a very negative view of the people among whom God had appointed him to serve. So this is very, very significant. In the very early years, after the American Revolution, before the War of 1812, definitely less than 40% of Canadians in Ontario had any connection to a church. We'll see the ones who mainly did in a minute. 50 years later, probably somewhere between 80 to 85% of people living in Ontario had some connection to an evangelical church. The 19th century is a great example of how God evangelizes Ontario with various gospel preachers. The initial ones who are most effective are the Methodists. And here's a number of Methodist leaders. And the way that the share feature is, you can't see them all easily. I'm going to talk about Baptists, obviously, in the course, but the dominant group in Ontario all through the 19th century were the Methodists, who would eventually form with a group of Presbyterians the United Church of Canada. When you go through Ontario and you drive through little villages like little towns like Listowel and Harriston and Brussels, I'm thinking of places I've driven over the last 20, 30 years, or Tillsonburg or Simcoe, and so on. All of them have a United Church. And they're big. And they reflect these 19th century congregations. By the 1880s, one of every three people living in Ontario was a Methodist. One out of every three. It's remarkable growth. And the great strength of Methodism was not only their evangelicalism, the Baptists are evangelical, but the fact that the Methodists had developed what we call the circuit rider. If you notice down here, you have this gentleman on a horse. That's a picture, actually, of a circuit rider named William Losey, who was a very, very prominent figure in this period. Sorry. Let me get back there. There we go. There we go. William Losey was a typical Methodist circuit rider. His preaching, we're told, was powerful, exhortatory, and apparently sometimes in his prayers he'd pray, "God smite sinners." I don't think I've ever heard anybody pray that publicly. And he was utterly fearless. These men were, they weren't resident pastors. They would travel on horseback to communities. They'd preach on the weekend and then travel to the next community. It was an ideal way of reaching Ontario. Scattered little communities of people, farms. Losey and the men that I'm going to talk about in a minute, they would preach anywhere, open air, barns, homes, as well as established church buildings. Now, the men that I've got here pictures of on the top right, and you can't really see him fully, is Lorenzo Dao, D-O-W, a very, very important Methodist preacher in America and in England. He did a number of preaching trips to England. He would come up to Canada, and during the spring, summer, and early fall, he'd do a circuit of preaching. He'd maybe cross at Kingston and then preach all the way across the North Shore of Lake Ontario. And then by the fall, he'd get to Niagara and cross back to the States, where he would spend the winter. The man beside him is William Case, who was also a very, very powerful Methodist circuit rider. And it was Case who holds one of the first camp meetings the Methodists developed this idea because people were scattered. They would invite them 3 or 4 times a year, particularly in the summer, to come on a weekend, to a Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, Monday morning, and enjoy Christian fellowship and preaching. One of the earliest camp meetings actually is in Ancaster in Ontario. If you want to see a building that was still used for camp meetings well into the 20th century, you need to go to Prince Edward County, over near Belleville, and it's a place called Hay Bay, and I've been there once, and it's just remarkable to think the thousands who came there to hear the gospel in the 19th century. William Case was a leading figure in the development of camp meetings as an evangelistic tool. One of the individuals who was converted under him is the man down in the lower right-hand corner. He was the son of a Welsh father and a Mississauga Indian woman. His English name is Peter Jones, but most historians today know him as Sacred Feathers. And you can actually see his Indian name there after his Peter Jones. This is the cover of a biography of him by Donald Smith, who's an expert in 19th century Methodist Indian relations. He had come to the meeting. William Case in the 1820s was converted and became probably the leading First Nations evangelist in Ontario. One of his close friends was Egerton Ryerson, after whom Ryerson University was named. And recently there was a big brouhaha, you may remember it, where they pulled Ryerson's statue down because of the discovery of the residential schools. And Ryerson had a very distant connection with that. But what was not, the whole thing really grieved me a little, because there was no realization of the complexity of the story. Egerton Ryerson was one of Peter Jones's closest friends. And he was a very, very good friend to many of the various First Nations peoples in Southern Ontario during his ministry. We'll talk a little bit about Egerton Ryerson later in the lectures. One final event that needs to be mentioned is the War of 1812. And there's a map there that depicts the war. The war was mainly fought in 3 areas: near Montreal, in the Niagara Peninsula, and then down near Detroit. There were some battles in the Atlantic, and the final battle was in 1815 in New Orleans. We call it the War of 1812. It's actually a 3-year war. It runs from 1812 to 1815. In some ways, it was a stupid war. The war, at the end of the war, the boundaries of British North America and the boundaries of the United States had not changed. What was the war about? The war was about the fact that England was involved in a massive war against the French, what we call the Napoleonic Wars. And sometimes the British Navy needed men. And what they would do in the Atlantic is they would stop American ships and they'd press gang the sailors. And like, you just can't go on. You can't do this to us. It was now an independent power. And but that's the immediate cause. Probably the long range cause is a conviction that some Americans have that all of North America should be under American control. The War of 1812 is very important because more than the American Revolution, it orients Canadians in Ontario towards Great Britain. If you asked a Canadian in Ontario, your typical Canadian walking down the street of Toronto, say 1900, who was he? What was he in terms of national identity? One of the first things he'd tell you is he was British. And the British Empire becomes a central factor in Canadian life in every facet of its world. And that's definitely true of Baptist life. Up until the 1960s, the dominant cultural influence on Canada was Great Britain. The 60s will change that. And what will change it is the emergence of the television. And everybody having a television in their home, and American TV would begin to reshape our culture. This is not a class on Canadian nationalism or a series of lectures on Canadian nationalism, but being a Canadian Baptist is different from being an American Baptist. And I hope at the end of the lectures, you'll have some feel for that. The War of 1812 was fought very much in the Niagara Peninsula. And in fact, the battlefield of Stony Creek, not far from, probably some of you live within 15 minutes of it. I don't know if you've ever been to it, you should. Every year there is a reenactment of the battle. We took our children to it once or twice. And I'm not sure what they'll do with social distancing. I imagine they canceled it this past year. I don't know. But there are a number of markers on the battlefield about the way in which British troops, regular troops, along with Canadian militiamen and First Nations warriors repelled the American invasion, which had crossed at near Fort George, and so on. Well, that's all of that is the background, because and really what I want to do is set the scene for where Baptists came from. How did Baptists figure in this world? As we'll see, the earliest Baptists in Ontario came with those Loyalists. And when they come, they'll start to set up churches. And it'll be the War of 1812 that'll determine them that the main influences on their life are going to be British Baptists rather than American Baptists. Having said that, we will nonetheless see American Baptist influence. For instance, William McMaster will marry an American Baptist named Sarah Moulton, and she'll want an American Baptist pastor in Jarvis Street Baptist Church. So our proximity to America will mean that American Baptists do have an influence. But up until the 1920s, the dominant influence is Britain. And anyway, so that's all of that as background. It's very much an overview, but I'm happy to take questions about anything that we talked about. This will normally be the format. I'll talk for about 50 minutes, and then we'll do Q&A. We'll definitely draw to a close if there's a lot of Q&A by 7:15. So we have about 25 minutes if you want to ask questions.
So if you do have a question, you can just unmute and maybe start your video if you do have video on, just so we can see you. And yeah, so yeah, feel free to ask questions now. Go ahead, Cheeto, if you have a question. I can see that hand raised, unless it's an accident.
No, it was an accident. It was intentional. So thanks. Mike, I just wanted to ask you the connection somehow of the Six Nations. I know the territory from, on the Grand River area there, the Haldimand Tract, which is 10 kilometers in, 10 kilometers on both sides of the river.
Right.
Was that pretty much Baptist territory at that time when the Haldimand Tract was enacted back in the 1700s?
No, Baptists. No, it wouldn't have been. The first Baptists that come into the area near Simcoe. As we'll see, Beamsville will claim that they've got the oldest Baptist church in Ontario. They claim it goes back to the late 1770s. There's no evidence of that. It's probably the 1790s. But the earliest church would be in the Niagara Peninsula. So that area then running along the Grand River would basically have been, there wouldn't have been any European settlement there. And it was an ideal context for the Six Nations in terms of a place that they could have. Joseph Brand himself would never, I mean, he may have lived there briefly, but he eventually ends up in what is now Burlington. With that, you can still see the house. He's a very interesting figure. Spends the last 5 years of his life writing a commentary in the Book of Revelation. He was a Christian. He was his sister Molly Brand, who lived in Kingston, was a remarkable Christian woman. And there are biographies of Joseph Brand. I don't know if there's one of Molly. Somebody needs to write a biography of Molly Brand. But they were remarkable Christians in their latter years. But no, there wouldn't have been any Baptists. Both of them would have been Anglicans. There wouldn't have been any Baptists in that area initially when that land was given to the Haudenosaunee. By the way, the Haudenosaunee is their preferred name. The word Iroquois, which is a French name, they normally don't like using that. They did ally themselves with the British during the wars against the French, and then during the American Revolution, which ended up because they lost, they had to come north and then be relocated. So that's the complexity of this. So when I was at that Mennonite church and the woman said, we're on the lands of the Haudenosaunee, but that only goes back to the 1780s. Before that, it was the land of the Huron and Ojibwe. And so you've got a complex world here. And then First Nation view of the land, the way we have different ways of viewing the land than we do. And history is very complex. When Joseph Brand, I find this also, you won't hear this normally. When Joseph Brand comes north, he comes with 2 African-American slaves. And so it's just a very complex, fallen world. And the media likes black and white kind of, it's simple, but history is not simple, and people are complex, and our dealings with one another are deeply complex. And this is very important, I think, in light of the sort of challenges I think we face in our culture, trying to rectify some of the wrongs of the past, but recognizing that there's a complexity in the past. I'm not trying to downplay the wrongs of the past in any way, shape, or form. I think in many ways, our Baptist forebears failed in some ways to understand the First Nations and how to evangelize them. And there has been a failure. And but there's a complexity here that needs to be recognized as well.
Thanks, Mike.
This is probably the material I went through is probably for some of you quite old. You probably went through it in grade 13. If you had grade 13. And I went to Ancaster High and Vocational School, and now Ancaster High School. And we had Canadian history in grade 10 and grade 13. We did the British Empire in grade 9. Then Canadian history, and then we did ancient history and medieval in grade 11. Grade 12, we had a very interesting teacher who wanted to do revolutions. I don't think that was on the program. This was 1970, remember? So we did the French, the Russian, the Chinese, Haitian revolutions, which is very interesting. And then grade 13, we did Canadian again. And I've still got my Canadian textbook. And I've looked at it over the years. And what is a shocker is if you took that course based on that textbook,
none of our Canadian ancestors were religious in the slightest. There's nothing mentioned about Methodism, Baptists, evangelicalism. It's as if that world didn't exist. It was a 1960s textbook written by secular historians who had no interest in religion. And it's a shocker to most people to realize that easily 80% of Ontarians heard the gospel on a regular basis in the 19th century. And that's not what was taught us in high school. I hope it's better now. Religion has become a more interesting topic to historians in the last 20, 30 years since the rise of Islam, which is intriguing. Well, if there aren't any questions,
I was just going to add.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Michael,
Yep.
that there were quite a few Quakers who came north. There was the Yonge Street settlement, and then you had the Children of the Peace, who were up in outside of, well, that amazing building that's outside of Newmarket. Right?
Yep.
At Sharon, the Sharon.
Yeah.
And that. So there were a lot of Americans who came up with some sort of background. I have family actually who came up late 1790s. They actually swore allegiance to the British Crown. That was expected prior to the
Right, it would be.
12.
Yeah.
But they also traveled quite a ways from Pickering and went over to the Yonge Street settlement for a while. And then there was the Pickering Quaker. But I don't know what happened with the Quakers.
Yeah, the Quakers tended to lose their evangelicalism in the 20th century, and they became pretty focused on pacifism. I didn't mention there were probably three groups that came north that did retain their religious identity. The Quakers were one, but they're never really, really large in Ontario. The Mennonites are another. They came as communities, and they were able to retain those bonds. And then the Moravians. We don't know much about the Moravians now, but the Moravians were very prominent down near Woodstock, down towards London, and they settled on the Thames River. They founded Moravian Town, which there was a tremendous movement of God among the Ohio First Nations. Two large Christian settlements of 2,000 and 3,000 that were virtually wiped out in the American Revolution, actually by Americans, not by the British, but it was Americans who attacked them and virtually destroyed them. And the man who led them was a man named David Zeisberger. He was a German-speaking Moravian. They were all German-speaking. Zeisberger got picked up in the early days of the American Revolution. He couldn't speak any English, and they asked him what he was doing out there in Ohio. And he said, I'm building the kingdom of the king. Well, the Americans hear that and they go, the guys on the British side, and also the British employed German mercenaries. And Zeisberger had no interest in either the American side or the British side. He was simply evangelizing the First Peoples. And it turned out disastrously. He spent 60 years in evangelistic work. By the end of it, he died in Michigan. He had virtually nothing to show for his labors. But there was a small group of First Peoples who came north and at Moravian Town. So there were groups, the Moravians, the Mennonites, and you're right to say the Quakers. They retained their religious links, but they were relatively small in terms of percentage in the larger context. Any other questions? Yeah.
When from what I can remember of most of the early missions movements that you hear about with William Carey, and then all the way through the 1800s, most of the efforts from the UK seem to be towards China, India, Africa. Was there efforts towards North America that are known, or towards Canada at that time, or were people mostly coming this way for land rather than religious or missionary reasons?
Yeah, well, we'll see Scottish Baptists. in either next week or the following week, we'll see Scottish Baptists take very seriously the need to evangelize in the Ottawa Valley. William Fraser is probably the name that is most prominent in my mind. Just a remarkable evangelist, does work in the Ottawa Valley. Then he goes to Tiverton and has a tremendous ministry in Tiverton. Tiverton's a little town. If you didn't have to come to a right angle when you go through it on the road, Highway 25, I think it is, or 26 from Port Elgin down to Kincardine, you'd be through it in 20, 30 seconds. He builds a church there around 300-400. And so you do have evangelists who do come out. William Carey actually did think about going to Canada. He mentions Canada in one of his letters, but he ends up in India, obviously. So there were people concerned for Canada, and especially when it becomes obvious in the early 19th century, the godlessness of many in Ontario. But the people who really build on that are the Methodists. As I said, 1/3 out of every Ontarians was a Methodist by the 1880s, and the Presbyterians. And both of them very early on established seminaries. And we'll see one of the big problems for Baptists, they just can't agree together to get a seminary. And we do not get a place to train leaders until the 1860s. 70 years after the first Baptist churches are planted here. It takes 70 years. So where do we train leaders? We send them down the United States. And half of them don't come back. And that's a real problem. And then Baptist autonomy is a real problem too. Baptists have a real difficult time agreeing to work together. There's one of the big lessons of this period is the inability of Baptists to work together and the inability of Baptists to work together in mission and theological education. And it hurts us enormously. And the Presbyterians and the Methodists, by 1830, both of them have got schools. Victoria College is the Methodist, Knox College is the Presbyterian. And Baptists, it's the 1860s. Well, we do found the schools, we'll see, in Montreal. But it would take you 6 days to travel from Toronto to Montreal. 6 days. You can do it 6 hours a day on the road. It would take you 6 days to do that trip. And as far as the school in Montreal was concerned, Ontario is in the boonies. And so there is a school that it lasts there from 1838 to 1849, but it's of very little value to the Ontario scene. And so Presbyterians and Methodists are able to take advantage of their organizational ability, and Baptists, because of our emphasis on independence, it hurts us. And one of the big lessons, I think, of this period is the importance of working together. But we'll see all that. It'll be writ large.
Hi, Dr. Haykin. I have a question about your circuit riders, your Methodist circuit riders. Were they, was it just sort of fueled by their answering the call to minister in this way on weekends? And did they have day jobs the rest of the week? Or kind of piggybacking a little bit on Jamie's question, but was that something that they felt called to do the entire time they were doing the preaching, or were they also involved in other work?
Yeah, most of the Methodist circuit riders, that's their full-time occupation. They're vocational, and the whole thing had been pioneered by John Wesley. John Wesley was basically a circuit rider. He has a house in London. I've been to 2 or 3 times. He was only a visitor in his house. He never lived there. And the big man who kind of evangelizes America is Francis Asbury. There's a biography just being written on him. He died in 1816. A man named John Wigger wrote a biography of him. He should be regarded as one of the founding fathers of America. He's an absolutely incredible figure. The last 5 years of his life, he was desperately ill. He couldn't even get on a horse by himself. He'd have to have friends put him on a horse and then prod the horse to get going. And he was just a remarkable, and that became the pattern of men in Ontario. The circuit rider, many of them were single. They weren't married. They were just impelled by the need to take the gospel to these isolated communities. I mean, the roads in Ontario in the early years are just, they're basically tracks that the First Nations peoples basically carved out of the forest. And it's not easy to get from community to community. And the circuit rider was a way of linking communities. He would bring mail. He was a letter carrier. He'd bring news. He'd bring newspapers, and he'd bring the gospel. And so during the week, what he might do then is he arrive in a community on the Friday. Saturday they might have a love feast, which is kind of a celebration of like the early Christians having a meal together. He'd preach all day Sunday. Monday he'd be off. He'd probably stop somewhere, maybe at isolated farms on the Tuesday. The Wednesday he might have another meeting somewhere else, and then he's on to the next community. And the Baptists tended to, they had some people like this, but they tended to be, they didn't do it in the winter, whereas a lot of these men would do it in the winter as well. They really are a remarkable group of men. And I mean, one of the things that I think that has been very helpful for me to realize something of the Catholicity of the church is the fact that God used such people to great effect. Even though I theologically would disagree with them on a number of areas, yet they were used quite remarkably. And this province was built by people like this, and we've forgotten them. It's sad in many ways.
I think too, there was the issue of hospitality, because they would have been going around and people would have welcomed them, at least fed them,
Yep.
Gave them someplace. So that showed a bit of that universality, that Catholicity that you were just commenting on. So that's interesting too. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, next week then, what I'd like to look at is early Baptist settlements, and we'll probably mostly focus on the settlements in the Niagara Peninsula, and then early Baptist associations, early Baptist growth up until the 1830s. And there'll be some political stuff that'll come in from time to time, but today was extraordinary, and most of it military, political, really to set the background for what we want to look at as we look at Baptist life. So Jamie, if you'd like to close in prayer. Next week, will Pastor Ullman be leading? You're off to Florida. You're off to Florida.
Yeah, if we can. Yeah, so for the next couple weeks, Pastor Chris Ullman will host, but yeah, I will close in prayer.
Thank you.
Heavenly Father, again, we thank you for this time together. Thank you for the strong connection that held us to be able to hear. And yeah, Lord, we just are in eager expectation of what you'll teach us through the rest of this time together. And now be with us as we go about our weeks. Keep us safe and in your care, and that we might just be your followers during this week, in the communities, at our workplace, in our neighborhoods, and just that you'd shine your light through us. We thank you for what you've done in the past, and that you'll continue to do even in our day. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Have a great week. God bless.